Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Wrestling in Rose City. I almost forgot the name right off the gate. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Portland wrestling. We're going to talk about the timeline, the wrestlers, the community impact of the wrestling promotion, because you don't hear a lot about Portland wrestling as much as you do the other promotions. And this is, I can't wait to start. We're going to start episode 1 right from the beginning. And to help me do that, I have some special friends with me. To my left, as you're looking at this, Dave in the HSV is here with me.
What's up, everybody?
And then for this show, so you're going to see me and Dave on here regularly, and then we're going to have a guest or two with us to help explain wrestling, not only in Portland, but in other areas to compare with the time. And underneath us, we have Brian Solomon, who not only has wrote the phenomenal book on the Shiek, but he's also writing a new book. I cannot wait for it to come out. Brian, what have you got going on? You're a busy man down there.
I am. I'm very busy. Literally down here. I'm underneath you. It's like the Brady Bunch. I just finished the manuscript for Irresistible Force, The Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon. That's the next book. I've got the foreword written by Bret Hart, who just sent it to me last week. So I'm very excited. Everything's coming together for that. You know, still work to be done, but the writing is finished.
Hot take here. Gorilla Monsoon is the greatest announcer in wrestling history.
I don't think that's a hot take. I don't think that's a hot take.
You know, it's funny. I'm writing the book, and even I don't hold that opinion. I thought he was great, but for me, it's Gordon Soley. But Gorilla Monsoon was great.
So nothing will ever top Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan.
I'll agree with you there. I mean,
the true voices of my childhood
as a team, yes, and they were the greatest, the absolute greatest.
Of course. We're going to get sidetracked off the gate, and I like it. So, of course, everyone gives props to Gorilla and Bobby, and they should. But Jesse and Gorilla are right behind him.
Yes. Absolutely. And when I was young, when I was a kid watching it, I actually preferred Gorilla and Jesse. Because, you know, like when you're a teenager, everything's like super serious, you know, and everything's all like you want it to be like as serious and real man as possible. And they were much more, you know, serious, you know, kind of sportscaster peers, like ribbing each other. Whereas Gorilla and Bobby were goofing off and having fun. And as a kid, I had a little less patience for that. But now, to me, I enjoy that much, much better. I'd rather watch an episode of primetime wrestling with them, you know, than just about anything else.
I would say Gorilla and Bobby's moment was Royal Rumble 92.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think Gorilla and Jesse's finest hour would be WrestleMania 3.
I was going to say 4.
Okay. Well, you know what? 4, it's interesting because 4 is usually considered one of the weaker WrestleManias, but I would say it's one of my favorite ones. But I think one of the best things about it is the Gorilla and Jesse commentary. Like they really pull it up and lift it up and kind of tie it together for that one. Yeah.
See, 4 to me was great.
It was very long.
That was my first WrestleMania that I remember watching.
Yes.
And you had Hogan Andre. But just the pageantry of all of it with Macho Man and coming out with a different outfit for every match. And it was just incredible. And it kind of, I think 3 was kind of the end of more of the old school type of wrestling. And 4 was when they started to usher in the new style of what was, you know, what we consider the golden era.
Well, 3 was sort of like the absolute turning point of the company going national. I mean, that was like the point where it was like solidified. But with 4, the thing about 4 is that's, to me, in a weird way, it's sort of like, even though Hogan would still be a big deal for years after that, that really was the end of that period where it was the Hulk Hogan show. Right. You know, for 4 years, it was the Hulk Hogan show. And he would have to kind of share the stage a little bit more. I thought it was a stroke of brilliance on that show that they had the Hogan Andre match in the middle of the show, and they both eliminate each other, because now you're watching it and you're going, oh, wow, okay, so we know for sure there's going to be somebody other than Hulk Hogan that's going to be the WWF champion at the end.
I rented that tape from the local video store, and I thought it was WrestleMania 3. I mean, I thought that was the WrestleMania of Hogan Andre. I didn't know, so I'm watching it, and I'm like, "What the shit is this?"
Well, I think that their match at WrestleMania 3, I love it. I think it's very entertaining, and I know Dave Meltzer gave it a notoriously bad review, and
-4 stars.
Right. I think it's a blast. The 4 match though is pretty rough. Andre's in really rough shape at that point. He can't really even do anything at all. But the 3 match I thought was really good.
So we can sit here and talk about Gorilla Monsoon all day, and we just mentioned this was the sign of WWF going global. Well, this is the opposite of that. This is the territory days, and actually, we're going to go well before that. We're going to go to the very beginning for Portland wrestling, and obviously, you have to go all the way back to 1883 to go back to the Portland wrestling. And for people who maybe don't understand, and by the way, all of our source material for this is coming out of Mike Rogers' book, Katie Bar the Door, which is a phenomenal book on Portland wrestling. All of us have a copy. It's fantastic. And I don't think so. You get the passive aggressive comment online about 15-minute headlocks and all other stuff. Wrestling shows really until the 19-teens, 1920s was 1 match, maybe 2 if you were lucky. And the main event was going to go an hour and a half to 2 hours. That was your wrestling show.
And there's no way I would have been a wrestling fan.
No.
It was a very different animal back then. It was not a packaged show that would happen sort of in the 30s and 40s. It was not like what we think of now where it's a whole card of matches. Mm-hmm. It comes to your local arena. It was much more like boxing. It was set up. Like if you go to see a heavyweight fight or a big title fight, maybe there's a couple of little preliminaries before that, but nobody cares.
Right.
I mean, you're there you're there
I completely agree.
You're there to see the main event. The whole show is sold on that. And that's the way wrestling was back then too. Yeah.
So, Dave, you're going to take us back here to the 1920s. So how did we get to the name Pacific Northwest Wrestling? What did that look like in the beginning?
Well, it started out, Pacific Northwest Wrestling started in the early 20s, as you said, and it was when former world middleweight and world light heavyweight, the Australian version wrestling champion by the name of Ted Ty, came to Portland with plans to promote both boxing and wrestling.
Here's Ted Ty, by the way.
And Ted Ty was a monster in the ring. He was 5'9" and weighed 168 pounds. So just a huge, massive dude, obviously. But Ty hired Herb Owen as his assistant. Now, what Ty is most famously known for is he was actually investigated for his business activities and the legitimacy of the business itself. So on March 27th, 1931, a man named Gus Larson said that he had some information that wrestling in the Portland area was not on the up and up. We think about that in these days and we're like, really?
This seemed to happen like every 20 years for a while.
So I pulled a little excerpt from a newspaper from back in 1931 right here. It says, Seattle, written in the AP, denying emphatically that they had participated in or sponsored fixed wrestling matches in Seattle and other Pacific Northwest cities. Ted Ty, prominent wrestler, and Virgil Hamlin, prominent the promoter, both of Portland, appeared before the Seattle Athletic Commission late Friday. They are heads of the Coast Athletic Club. The hearing was behind closed doors, and the commission refused to divulge the statements made by Ty and Hamlin, except to say that the two had denied charges made a week ago by Abe Cubey, a Seattle referee, and Charlie Hansen and George McDowell, both local wrestlers. So, like I said, one of Ty's main accusers was a referee named Abe Cubey, and on April 1st, 1931, the commission determined that the charges against Ty hadn't been proven in any shape or form. But this really hurt Ty in the area by having one of his referees and 2 wrestlers for his promotions come out and say that the fights were fixed.
That's something that was going on all through the 30s. The 30s was a disaster for wrestling in a lot of places. I'm reading Steve Johnson's book on Jim Londos right now, and it's talking about that too, where it's something similar to what you were just saying, Dave, where like an actual participant will come forward, like a referee or like a jilted promoter or something, and say, "Hey, look, I know this for a fact because I was part of it." You know, wrestling was fighting that battle at the time. We laugh about it now because it's so entrenched as entertainment, but even though back then people had suspicions and things, it wasn't really out in the open, and they would still deny it to their dying breath. I mean, to protect their business back then.
Well, that's like Bruno Sammartino always said it was always real unless he lost, and then this is in the 70s. Who 40 years later?
Eddie Mansfield's probably the most recent famous one, I'd say.
Well, now forget it. I mean, it's out. Triple H just gave a press conference where he basically talked about works and shoots and heels and phases. I mean, that's out the window. But Eddie Mansfield in the 80s did it.
From what I remember reading, and this was back when I was a teenager, that wrestling was, originally a carny sideshow, and it was all legitimate wrestling contests. There weren't people doing 450 moonsaults and shit off the ropes. But it was a wrestling contest. There weren't punches and leg drops and all that. But from what I remember reading was that the wrestlers themselves are the ones that ended up kind of creating a kayfabe world in which they made wrestling more fixed.
Yes.
For the money.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And everyone had to know how to do it for real back then, because otherwise you could get screwed over. Somebody could easily double cross you, or you had to know how to handle yourself, because they were all legit wrestlers, but they just had agreements among each other over, who was going to win, and we're not going to hurt each other. That was it.
So, but Portland, as we know, is owned by Owen, the Owen family, Herb Owen, Don Owen. While Ty was on a trip to Australia, Herb Owen had the ownership of the company put in his name. Due to rules in effect in the state of Oregon at the time, Owen now had sole rights to sponsor all boxing and wrestling within the state. Owen started out just promoting boxing matches, but soon began promoting wrestling matches as well, focusing on lightweights. So Portland started out as a lightweight promotion, which, back then, you're not going to see steroided out guys. You're going to see legitimate wrestlers that are much smaller. And you think about that. But that's when his sons, Don and Elton, began helping their father in the family business. And that's what grew Portland wrestling to what it became. And then, what they had another almost 50 years running.
Yeah.
So it went to 91.
91. Well, this incarnation, there was one later, but this incarnate was 91. Yeah, we know.
The Owen Company. Yeah, their company.
Right. But how do you think Ty felt? I'm going to go to Australia.
Right.
And he was from South Dakota, but made his living and was well known in Australia. That's where he grew himself as a professional wrestler and a promoter. Came back over here. He goes back over there on like a little vacation siesta type gimmick, and comes back and his company's taken over by his assistant.
That's crazy.
Stuff like that would happen. It was very cutthroat. I mean, when I wrote my book about the Shiek, he used to go to Japan a lot, and he was very paranoid about going there because, he would leave his company in Detroit. And one time his paranoia was founded because he came back. They were waiting for him to leave, and a bunch of the wrestlers and his booker, they staged a coup. They walked out, they started their own promotion, and he had to leave the Japanese tour early and come back and try to sort it out because they were all running opposition against him while he was gone. That's the business.
So that's interesting because that's what we would call an outlaw promotion, and we have a whole topic about that later. So let's revisit that here in a minute.
Sure, guys. I just have to step away really quick, if that's okay. I'll be right back. I just have to step away for like literally a minute, and I'll be right back. Okay.
So now with the teaser of going to Outlaw Promotions here later a little bit, let's come back to Herb Owen in the beginning, because there was actually a very key figure that he works with who become a key figure in territory wrestling as we went on. So Herb Owen, when we're talking about that, when Herb's still at the helm, he gets other partners in the Western Athletic Club promotion, including some guy named Paul Bosch. So some of our listeners may not be familiar with who Paul Bosch is. So let's do some background on Paul. He began wrestling in the 30s and suspended his career to go in the Army during World War II. He'd become a lieutenant and lead his infantry brigade against the Germans after the D-Day landing in one of the more intense battles during the war, the Battle of Hurtgen Forest. Several American troops were lost, and Bosch himself was injured by an artillery shell. He still came back and wrestled, but it was in a severe car accident in October of 47 that ended his in-ring career entirely. After this accident, Morris Siegel approached Bosch about helping run the growing Houston wrestling office, and Bosch would then become a mainstay in Houston for the next 30 years. So for people who, and we're going to get into the NWA also, but the NWA had these, at one point there's been over 70 members, I believe, at one time or another, but at their biggest, they probably had 20 at one time. But you had the staples of the NWA. You had St. Louis, you had Kansas City, Florida. Paul Bosch in Houston was definitely one of them, was a big-time player in the NWA. And it's just so odd to me that he gets his sort of his unceremonious start here working for Herb Owen in the Western Athletic Club. Like, I did not see that one coming when I was reading this book.
Yeah, I didn't know that he was down there or up there either myself. I knew he wrestled a lot in the New York area. In fact, that's how he met in fact, I think he was from Queens or something, or somewhere on Long Island. And he introduced Stu and Helen Hart when because Stu Hart, when he was wrestling in New York, he introduced him to Helen Hart, who was from New York. And then they went out to Calgary, which is where Stu was from. But so I guess Paul Bosch was all over the place then.
He's everywhere.
I have a feeling when Brian gets to know me, he's not going to like me.
Dave's not a big fan of the Hearts.
Oh, boy. Okay. No, I'll have to tell Brett and Ross about you.
Hey, leave me out of it. I'm a fan. So the Western Athletic Club in that form, they stay in prominence in the scene until 1942 when Herb passes away. And as Dave said earlier, Elton and Don then take over. And before we dive into the beginning of the Don Owen timeline as we head into the 50s, Brian, something very important happened in 1948. So we just kind of alluded to it. So what can you tell us about the NWA in its early incarnation here from 48 until Don Owen really grabs his footing and takes over in the mid-50s in 1960?
Well, the NWA kind of came together partly as a result of what we were talking about before, where you had these years of chaos. The 30s and 40s was just a very chaotic time in pro wrestling. It was the first time where you really had territories taking shape. So because of that, the promoters weren't trusting each other and multiple world title claimants. It was just very chaotic, a lot of exposés in the press. And so the idea of the NWA, which was Pinky George out of Iowa, I think, and it grew out of the Midwest. Sam Muchnick, there he is. Sam Muchnick came along not long after, but he eventually was the president for a very long time. And the idea of the NWA was to sort of get everyone on the same page. It was like, hey, let's all make money together. We don't have to fight each other. We the NWA, contrary to I think some misunderstandings, it was not a wrestling promotion or company.
Right.
It was a conglomerate, an association of various different companies. I actually helped to create this map. I see it floating around on the internet all the time.
That's where I got it from. So,
it's
thank you.
We put it together when I was in WWE for one of the magazine projects we did. But the idea was we'll all get on the same page. We'll share talent. So we're not fighting over wrestlers. And the most important thing, we'll have one world champion. We'll all recognize him. He gets to come to every territory. We can all make money with this, and we don't have to fight each other. Now, never mind the fact that this is sort of technically illegal because it's collusion and it's monopolistic practices because they're going to run anybody out of town that tries to run. So basically it's like, okay, you're in Kansas. Okay, you're the NWA promoter in Kansas. Congratulations. Nobody else can promote wrestling in this state except you. Really not kosher. But that's what it came out of, this desire to like get the business under control and make money instead of just endlessly fighting.
And see, that's what's so intriguing to me, because when I think of the NWA, I strictly think of Jim Crockett Promotions in the 1980s.
Right. Which is such a funny thing, because I think it's a generational thing, because if you're of that age, right, in the 80s, Jim Crockett was very smart, and in order to fight Vince McMahon and the WWF, he branded Jim Crockett Promotions so thoroughly and successfully with those letters NWA that it confused the hell out of everybody. But if you think about it, what's crazy is that period that we all remember, Jim Crockett Promotions is the NWA. It's basically like from about 1985 to about 1988. It's a very short period where they did that. And even a little bit into the WCW era, like 89 into 90, they were still calling it the NWA. And it was intentional consumer marketplace confusion. They just wanted you to think exactly that the NWA was just this one company.
See, and I didn't really understand how the NWA worked. And, and for me, I grew up in North Carolina, of all places, in the 80s. But my heart and soul was in New York with the World Wrestling Federation. That is what I watched. I didn't watch a lot of NWA. I would see some NWA from time to time, but on our Patreon network, I'm going back and started at the Dusty Rhodes Hard Times promo, and we're going to work our way all the way through 2001. WCW. But I'm going back and watching a lot of NWA wrestling for the first time ever.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you there.
But I didn't understand how the NWA really worked with their territory system until, the invention of the WWE network, when I would go back and watch old shows from World Class. Like, I thought World Class was its own entity. I thought the AWA was its own entity.
Well, that one was.
Well, I thought it was like you had World Class, you had the AWA, you had the WWF, and then you had what I thought the NWA was Crockett.
And to be fair, I mean, by the time you get to like 85, 86, 87, it pretty much is. I mean, there isn't that. The territories were really dying. And Jim Crockett, I mean, Don Owen was one of the only other surviving members around that time. I mean, everybody was just dying out. Florida went under in 87, and, Crockett himself took over Florida, I think, and took over Central States. And, and they were just absorbing, Mid-South, the UWF. So it really, the champion, even by the time you get to that period, 85, 86, where it's Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes, like, you don't have the traveling NWA world champion anymore. By that point, the NWA world champion is really just the champion of Jim Crockett Promotions. I mean, that's really what it turned into.
When did Kerry Von Erich win it?
84. And I was going to say, that's probably the last year where it really truly was still that traveling champion, because Flair went down to World Class and he lost the title to Kerry. You wouldn't see after 84. You just don't see stuff like that happening anymore. All the title changes are happening within JCP, and even like the change is happening because another reason why Kerry didn't hold it for very long, other than the fact that he was Kerry and they couldn't rely on him. But there was that tug of war where Crockett, he was the NWA president and he controlled the champion, which was a recipe for disaster. So he just wanted Flair as the champ. He wanted to control the champ. He didn't want to lose control. If Kerry's the champ full time, now all of a sudden Fritz Von Erich has control of the world champion. So it was, okay, we'll give it to Kerry, but I need it back. I mean, that really was what it was. I need it back because we got a big show coming up in the Meadowlands or wherever it was, Ric Flair versus Ricky Steamboat. I need Flair to be the world champion by the time we have that show. So he's got to get it back. So that was that whole thing, that touring champ, the territories, the traditional NWA was almost dead already, even by 84.
So the initial charter members of the NWA was Pinky George, as you said.
Yes.
Al Haft.
There he is, Columbus, Ohio.
Tony Stecker.
Minneapolis.
Yep. Harry Light out
Detroit.
of Detroit. And then Don Owen was the other one.
Yep.
So those were, and I forgot the most important, the inaugural NWA champion who was also on the NWA panel was Orville Brown.
Yes, and he was in Kansas City. I think
that's right.
Yeah.
So wrestling, we just kind of mentioned the reasoning behind the forming of the NWA, the chaos, the backstabbing, which again, Tim Hornbaker writes a phenomenal books on the NWA, the history of the NWA, why it happened. It's fantastic. But
great
in the 50s, while the backstage politicking is still going on, wrestling does start to take off in popularity because now there's this new thing in the average American home called television. And although nationwide broadcasting, you had 3 channels. You had Dumont, ABC, and NBC were the 3, I think.
It was NBC and CBS. ABC came a little later, yeah.
And but you would end up getting these local affiliates, which were huge, obviously. So the next topic is how does local television kind of lead the charge to bring wrestling kind of to the next stage? And again, it blossomed in popularity here in the mid to late 50s.
Yeah, I mean the television is probably the biggest sea change in wrestling history. People were saying with Raw coming to Netflix last week, everybody was saying how, this is the biggest media shift in wrestling history. And I'm like, recency bias is a real thing, but I don't think anything could ever top the invention of television because it changed everything. People like to talk about casual wrestling fans today. It's a big deal. Like, who's casual wrestling fan? What do they like? There were no casual wrestling fans before television because the only way to see wrestling would be you had to buy a ticket and go there live. And you're not doing that unless you're like a real wrestling fan.
Right.
You're not going to do that. With television, you had the ability, just like with everything else that came through on TV, you could just turn it on and check it out. And I'm curious, what is this thing? And it turned a lot of people into wrestling fans. And that was a major craze from about, I guess it's like 46 is when you have the first wrestling television broadcast. I think it was out of LA. And then you had the big one in Chicago, which was Wrestling at the Marigold, which was a national broadcast on the Dumont network. By 49, 50 is kind of like the peak of this craze. Gorgeous George becomes a household name. And the whole thing collapsed by the middle of the 50s. It just it was a fad, and it burned out. The national broadcast went away, and then everything became very local. But you had some, even during that period, you had local wrestling TV, like Detroit. You were mentioning with Harry Light. They had their own show in the Detroit area. New York, there was Capital Wrestling out of Washington, D.C., which was the future WWF. There were things like that. And I believe, and maybe this is where you're going with it, but the Portland Wrestling TV, doesn't it start like in the mid 50s, right? Which is right around the time that the golden age of wrestling on TV is ending kind of at that point. Yeah. It's like 55, 56 or something like that.
What was wrestling like on TV then, though? Because you think about with us, each of us, I assume we're all born in the 80s.
70s.
So you're 70s, so you're a little older. But what we watched on television was mainly enhancement matches. Growing up, you go back and watch NWA World Championship Wrestling or NWA Worldwide Wrestling or WWF Superstars or Wrestling Challenge or, whatever. So I guess everyone, when you would get, I'm drawing a blank, the show with Gorilla and Bobby, Primetime. So when you get primetime, you would get a main event in there at the end of the show, your main event. But you're watching stuff that was recorded, at a Superstars taping, and all these things were taped for fans there live. But if you wanted to see any of the big matches, it wasn't going to be on television. You had to actually go to an arena and watch the show live.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of was the format. I think there's a great example of a show, because a lot of that early TV is gone, unfortunately. But there was television from Chicago's International Amphitheater, which was late 40s, early 50s, and is super well preserved. The Library of Congress actually uploaded the whole damn thing. You can find it and you can watch them, and it gives you an idea what it was like. And I would have to say it's kind of like what we're used to, but a little bit better in terms of the match quality. Like, you definitely got more competitive matches, even though probably if you knew the wrestlers back then, if you were really clued in, you could probably figure out who was going to win, but you didn't really have true squash matches like we think of, where a guy is just getting annihilated, like the Mulkeys or, Barry Horowitz and that kind of thing. You didn't have that. They were more competitive, but it was sort of like big main event guy against like mid-card guy. There was a lot of that. And then for the first time ever, you had promos. There were no wrestling promos before television, because how could there be, right? I mean, right. What are you going to do? You're not going to, the wrestlers did not need to be able to talk until TV. That's huge. That's a huge deal.
And I want to say the oldest wrestling I remember watching was with our podcast, the Filter Free Podcast. We did a show. It was in Indiana. I want to say it was like 1967.
Okay. Yes, it was 1967. Yeah.
And we're watching it, and it's not squash matches per se, but even us watching we know who's going to win.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
But then you get, I think it was like the last match of the night, and there's a young man named Beautiful Bobby Heenan.
Yep.
Yep.
And we're all we were shocked. Oh my God, it's Bobby Heenan.
That's Dick the Bruiser's promotion. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and it was Dick the Bruiser. He was manager of Dick the Bruiser.
Yeah.
So we watched that, and I always give the guys a cutoff of, if it's before like WrestleMania 3, I ain't trying to watch it.
I would. That's definitely not my attitude, but no.
But see, I was, like I said, born in 81.
Yeah.
Grew up in the golden era. WrestleMania 4 is when, to me, it really became the wrestling that I knew and loved. But I'm also the guy that, I liked 1992 WWF, 1994 WWF. So
yeah, I did too. Yeah.
It is what it is. But, up until the, Monday Night Raw became a thing. And even then, even those early Monday Night Raws up until like 1995, 96, they had enhancement matches on Monday Night Raw. You started to see more and more of non-enhancement matches. But like, you think about the first ever match on Monday Night Raw was Yokozuna versus Koko Beware.
Mm-hmm.
Now, by 93, you know what you're going to see with Yokozuna versus Koko Beware.
Right.
Yes.
But at one point in time, especially as a member of Pretty Young Things down in Mid-South and stuff like, Koko Beware was a star.
Well, that's kind of like that match we were talking about, where it's like, it's a top guy against a not top guy, but not bottom guy. And you kind of know who's going to win, and it's somewhat competitive, although I don't think that one was super competitive.
It was not.
But
I was there that night.
This is what excites me about Portland, because I have absolutely zero knowledge of Portland wrestling. And TJ one day says, "Hey guys, I have the opportunity to buy the library of Portland wrestling. Do you think we should buy it?" And the immediate response was, "Hell yeah, we should buy it, because this is something we've never seen, and we can watch new things. And especially once it really gets going." And, you read the book, Katie Bar the Door, and it has so many of the results of things that happen. And there's so many names of wrestlers that you do know, the Gorgeous Georges and things of that nature. But then there's so many wrestlers that were like, wait a minute, who's this guy? And with the modern invention of the thing called the internet, we can all go back and look. I mean, there's countless text messages between TJ and myself saying, holy shit, here's this guy here who's got a crazy life story. We could, we can look at this guy, find some stuff out, try and find some of his matches on these things we have, and we can dedicate shows strictly to one wrestler that, that was in the Portland territory. And we can learn about this wrestler and, let the world know about this wrestler, because you have to think the vast majority of us out there don't have a lot of knowledge on Portland wrestling. Right. So this is going to be a new door that we're opening up to a lot of people. So it's just another fun thing. And, the matches, a Bruno Sammartino match or a 1977 Bob Backlund match, I'd probably rather scratch my eyes out than watch.
Okay.
But that's because I grew up on leg drops and hulking up.
I could recommend some Backlund matches that would blow you away, but we could do that after the show or whatever.
Well, we watched one of the shows we did. We watched the Hogan match. The Bruno match after he came back from Hanson breaking his neck. It was Hanson in the cage. And that was crazy. That one was good.
That is that the Garden one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
See, and we've done a show on the Garden, and I always love the Garden matches. When we did a show one time from the early 80s, or it might have been even in the 70s at the Garden, and it's at the height of the Night Stalker.
Mm-hmm.
So
no, it's Son of Sam.
There's Son of Sam. Yeah,
it was 1977.
California. So
77. So, yeah.
So there's 2 minutes left in the show, and they're starting at 2 out of 3 falls that we get 2 minutes into, and they're like, "Well, that's it. It's curtain time because everybody's got to go home for curfew."
Yes.
We're like, what just happened here?
The Garden was weird like that. It was 11 o'clock p.m. It was a union thing. If your show went to 11:01, it didn't matter if it was wrestling or anything else. You were paying all these guys double overtime to break everything down and do everything. So you better believe when the clock struck 11, that show was over. And there were a lot of shows that would just abruptly go to curfew. It was kind of a weird thing. That's why in the Garden, they never put the main event on last. If you guys ever noticed that, because they didn't want to have to worry about that with the main event. So you'd have your main event, and then it'd be like 1 or 2 matches later after that. So they wouldn't have to worry if there was a curfew thing that happened. Yeah. It was weird.
So there's all these things that are weird and kind of like things that we can't fathom before. And then there's this story I found. So we're in the 1950s. Don Owen, I should say, is working in conjunction with boxer and promoter Mac Lillard. Here's an interesting note from 1954. Mac is putting on cards with women wrestlers, specifically Jerry Hunter and Ella Kowalski. Now, the Oregon governor at the time was a guy by the name of Paul Patterson. And he releases a statement saying the state of Oregon will no longer allow cards that have women on them, which to me is bananas. And Lillard continued to do it anyway. And on May 7th, 1955, he's threatened with a $500 fine and 1 year in jail if he promotes one more show with women wrestlers on it. And
what are you in here for?
Women wrestling.
Promoting women's wrestling.
So it appears 2 weeks later, on May 21st, that looks like the last card Lillard ever promoted, which is crazy. So, Brian, you grew up watching, and you even worked for the McMahons. You kind of alluded to that earlier.
Yeah. Yep.
When the AWA went under, I was 5. So unfortunately, and actually, so did Dick the Bruiser. Went under when I was 5. Also, both were in 1990. So AWA would have been my home territory right here on the southern tip of Lake Michigan in Indiana. But I've done some researching on the AWA because I am interested in that territory because it would have been what I would have watched had it still been around.
Right.
But I don't remember ever hearing anything like this where the governor of a state says if you promote insert, my daughter's losing her mind upstairs. If you promote whatever this is, I'm going to fine you and put you in jail. Has this happened in New York? Because I don't recall it.
There were the athletic commissions.
Well, yeah,
I don't know about the governor. That would be crazy, but that he would actually bother with something like that. Usually when stuff like this would happen, it would be the states that had athletic commissions. Not all states did or do. New York has one, and back in the day, they were pretty intense. They were one of the most notorious ones because they had this attitude. Well, I mean, a lot of it was corruption and payoffs and things, but they had this attitude in New York because you had the Garden and they wanted to keep ring sports, boxing, wrestling, whatever, as respectable as possible. So they had all these rules in place. Women's wrestling was banned in New York until 1972. In fact, one of the things that the McMahons were very proud of was that Vince McMahon Sr., in conjunction with Fabulous Moolah, they got the ban lifted in 72. And Fabulous Moolah against somebody, I don't remember, in 1972 became the first women's match ever held at Madison Square Garden, which had been having wrestling for like 90 years by that point. It was the first. And they had a ban on masked wrestlers at Madison Square Garden. It was legit. You could not have your face covered. And they would do this insane thing where if you were a mask-wearing wrestler, if you either had to just take your mask off totally, or if you wanted to, don't ask me why they would do this. You had the option. You could wear a mask with the face cut out. So you see guys like the Spoiler does this, El Olympico, like these men. The only guy, and I don't know how he pulled this off, the guy was bulletproof, Mil Mascaras. Not only did he never have to do jobs for anybody, he was the only guy that was allowed. They allowed him to wear a mask in the Garden. Probably a lot of money changed hands. But so, yeah, the state athletic commissions, they had these pretty intense rules regulating wrestling. This is why Vince McMahon wanted them off his back. And in 89, they made that ruling in New Jersey, in Trenton, where they said, look, this is a show. This is not a sport.
Right.
We don't need to be regulated by the state athletic commission. Everybody was like, how could you do that? It's because they didn't want to deal with nonsense like that. That's why.
So we discussed earlier about Ted Ty and Virgil Hamblin, and then the Owen family, and this whole idea of outlaw promotions, which to me, by far, the most interesting wrestling stories, really from the beginning until the late 1980s, is this idea of an outlaw promotion. So let's first define the term. An outlaw promotion was one that ran outside of the NWA governing body approval and also ran in an already established wrestling territory. So I've got a couple here as the most famous outlaw promotions that if you haven't heard of them, it would not be hard to research them. So you have Superstars of Wrestling, ran by George Cannon from 76 to 83 out of Detroit. And then you have International Championship Wrestling, which is probably the most famous one, out of Lexington, Kentucky. That was ran by Angelo Poffo from 78 to 84 and gave us some guy named Randy Savage. I don't know if you've heard of him. And then, which, by the way, I could do an entire show on ICW in Memphis, just that by itself, because it's fantastic.
And there's a lot of great footage from ICW that's still floating around. There's a lot of shows. There's a lot of stuff to watch. I
have one of their cards hanging up behind me. It's George Weingeroff and Randy Savage is the main event. All-Star Championship Wrestling out of Knoxville, Tennessee, which ran in 79 and 80, which does not seem like that long, but it was ran by Bob Orton Jr., Ronnie Garvin, Bob Roop, Boris Malenko, and Ron Wright. How's that for a group?
Yeah.
And they actually ended up merging with the Poffos. And then Joe Blanchard out of San Antonio ran against NWA Big Time Wrestling. And then Roy Shire out of San Francisco, maybe one of the few outlaw success stories. He ran against NWA Los Angeles. And after he actually successfully ran LA out of business, he just took their place out of San Francisco. That might be the only instance of that happening I know of the NWA.
Well, yeah, Roy Shire, and actually the LA territory was itself an outlaw for a while, because in the 60s, they were in the late 50s and 60s, they were known as the World Wrestling Association, which was also the name of Dick the Bruiser's promotion, which was another outlaw, by the way. So, and they both had their own world champion. So in California, like, people don't realize, I think, that the NWA did not totally have the kind of stranglehold that people think. There were lots of areas. I mean, New York for many years wasn't a part of it. Capital Wrestling, WWF, was not a part of it in the 60s, wasn't a part of it, obviously after, 83, 84. and California was out of it for a while. In World Class left at certain points. Mid-South wasn't in it at certain points. So like it really is much more in flux. Basically, the promoters that tended to be in it full time were the ones that felt that they needed it the most. If there were promoters that would be like, well, what do we need this for? Let's just do this ourselves. They would leave. They would break away. So, it's a lot more like fluid than people realize.
Yeah, and you theoretically you could start a wrestling promotion in the Dakotas, but what is the upside to that? There's the population just isn't there. So that's why you would see, for some reason, like Memphis seemed to be just a treasure trove for outlaw promotions. I never really understood that. And then St. Louis, and you mentioned Dick the Bruiser in the the Indiana, Detroit, Chicagoland area. Yeah. Detroit had a couple. New York had a ton. So did Boston. And it's the NWA, they can't necessarily say like, well, you can't run here, but if you do decide to post up shop here, they can make it real hard on you.
Oh, they could really. You want to talk about ICW? There were things. It went to court. There were antitrust lawsuits. Yep. The PAFOs were suing, and they had documents in court where they were talking about crazy things like Jim Barnett ordering Ronnie Garvin to basically attack, I think it was Randy Savage or Lanny Poffo in a match where like he hit him with a cinder block.
Oh.
And it wasn't gimmicked. Like it was they were trying to really mess him up. And supposedly under orders from Jim Barnett, who was the treasurer of the NWA and the guy who booked the NWA World Champion. This is highly illegal practices going on here. They would drive you out of business if they could. If you were running opposition to them, they would basically. So the Shiek, to bring it back to the Shiek, when the Bruiser tries to invade and he's an outlaw and the Sheik's an NWA member, the Bruiser comes into Detroit. So the Shiek is basically like, he's running shows in the city of Detroit on the same night as me. What are we going to do about this? So all the NWA promoters get together, and this includes Vince McMahon Sr. in the WWF, and they send wrestlers in to Detroit from all over the place to appear at Sheik's wrestling cards to try to wipe out whatever other show is running there. So all of a sudden you show up at Cobo Arena and it's like, oh, the Funks are here. Bruno Sammartino's here. Andre the Giant's here. Dusty Rhodes is here. Holy shit. Why am I going to go see this other show? Like, that's also how the NWA worked.
And of course, there's Jim Ross's famous story where he said he was in the bathroom and overheard, some of the promoters concocting a plot to take out Vince Jr. Like, I love the NWA. There's nothing about it I don't enjoy.
It is great. I love that story. I don't doubt it for a second. And I try to imagine in my head who it was, because he's never going to say.
Right.
But I try to imagine. I'm thinking Bill Watts had to be one of those people that was having that conversation.
Absolutely.
But,
who would then go and work for Vince.
Yeah.
That's wrestling.
Mm-hmm. So then we're going to finally make our way here to 1960, which is really kind of where, at least for television purposes and, documented history, kind of the beginning of Portland wrestling or Pacific Northwest wrestling. So let's talk about some of the stars they had, and then that's how we'll wrap up today's show. Portland was using stars such as Ed Francis, and I was professional, and I got visual aids ahead of time. So there's Ed Francis.
All right.
And they had the tag team of Shag Thomas, who was also one of their would become one of the 4 inaugural champions. Shag Thomas and Tony Bourne, who some of you may know his son was Doink the Clown, Matt Bourne. And then they had Luigi Massera, Jerry Kozak, and Duke Kiyamuka. So I don't think enough people know about Duke Kiyamuka and his story, especially. It's crazy. I had to look this guy up after I read about him in the book. So this is just the unfortunate time of Duke's heritage and the time he grew up in America was during World War II. his family was of Japanese American descent. So if for people who aren't aware of this, Japanese American citizens were interned at the Manzanar camp at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. That's where his family was. There was actually a couple different ones. And not only were they sent to those camps, in the majority of the cases, their property was repossessed. And when they were eventually released, they were released to nothing. So, I mean, it's like just a terrible side effect of World War II that I don't think we discuss enough. And Duke's family was a part of it. Now, he would, of course, go on to become a professional wrestler, and he wrestled here in Portland. He wrestled a lot of places. He was all over the place. But he also had a son that a lot of us know about by the name of Pat Tanaka, who I don't think is just due. There's a stretch from like 1990 to 1993 where the Orient Express opens every single show or pay-per-view wrestling either the Hart Foundation or the Rockers, and it just crushes every single time.
Yeah. And
another character in this, and you just kind of, with the ICW lawsuit, I had never heard of Kurt Van Poppenheim before I read this book, ever. And he would become a star in Portland, and then he tried to run Outlaw. Was unsuccessful. And then he would sue the NWA in probably the more infamous wrestling lawsuits ever. And that story is so crazy. Kurt Van Poppenheim will be episode 2. So his career in Portland, the NWA lawsuit, it's all just fascinating. And again, go by Katie Bar the Door by Mike Rogers. You get to read all about these people. But I think Kurt Van Poppenheim might accidentally be one of the more impactful wrestlers of all time that no one's ever heard of.
Yeah, there were some of those. And there's another famous one. I can't remember the name. Tim Hornbaker devotes a whole chapter to him in the NWA book. There was a guy who was claiming, I'm trying to get work. I'm a wrestler, and I can't get work anywhere because of this collusion of wrestling promoters. The FBI was investigating the NWA. I mean, it was serious. You had even they tried to sort of tone things down after that. And that's another reason why people say, well, why did the NWA tolerate having the AWA? And then you had a WWF champion. And then even into the 70s, when Vince Sr. rejoins the NWA, they still had the WWF heavyweight champion. And one of the reasons they started to get lenient with that was exactly this. They didn't want to get in trouble with the FBI. They were loosening up a little bit, but they were in a lot of trouble. They almost got shut down over that.
And another fascinating story is the reason why the AWA was never in the NWA.
Yeah, that's true. It never was. Yeah,
because of Vernon Luthez.
Yeah, because the whole reason that basically Vern Gagne started the AWA is because they wouldn't make him NWA world champion. Only in wrestling could you do this, right? So Vern Gagne was a huge star in the wrestling golden age in the 50s. He was like a household name, and everybody wanted to see him against Luthez. Luthez, of course, was the standard bearer of the NWA in the 50s. He was like the personification. And politically, whatever, it never came to be. So he said, you know what? Me and my brother are just good. No, actually, it was just Vern. It wasn't his brother. But they said, we're going to buy this Minneapolis territory from Tony Stecker, who was an NWA member. Tony Stecker had died, and it was kind of in limbo. There he is. His brother was Joe Stecker, who was the longtime world champion way back when. But Vern Gagne buys the territory, pulls it out of the NWA, and just starts his own company and makes himself world champion for basically, even though he lost it many times, essentially from like 1960 to 1975, he's most of the time the AWA world champion.
I believe he was 11-time AWA world champion.
Something like that.
And of course, he beat Nick Botwinkle in his retirement match and retired champion.
Yes, which was like, so he went 5 years without the belt. You'd think he's kind of riding off into the sunset, but no, he beats Nick Bockwinkel after 5 years, holds the title, then retires, doesn't lose it to anybody, and just gives it back to Nick Bockwinkel.
Who I believe at the time Vern was 59.
Vern was somewhere like that. I think the only, maybe 56. I think the only world champion who older than Vern Gagne in wrestling history was when Vince was the WWF champion. I think that might be the only one. I think Goldberg, believe it or not, might be close because he's up there. He's in his 50s when the last time he held it. But Vern Gagne was, he was definitely in his late 50s that last time.
I think Goldberg was 54.
Why it went out of business.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You wonder why they went out of business. Dude. This is why. But Goldberg, you said was 53.
I think it's 53, 54, somewhere in there.
So he might have been the closest one. Yeah.
Yeah. And the frustrating about the AWA, they had Hogan.
Yep.
Before 83, and they're like, no.
I know. And they have, they tell weird stories about it. Like even Greg Gagne to this day, they'll have this. There was this rumor, this story that went around. And at first I believed it, but I just think it's them trying to put the blame off themselves. They were saying how we wanted Vern and his, and Greg Gagne, they wanted to put the world title on Hogan. They wanted him to be champ, but Hogan didn't want it. That's what they were trying to say. That Hogan didn't want it because he wanted to be able to go to Japan, which is nonsense because the minute Vince put the belt on him, he basically stopped going to Japan.
Right.
And they said, well, he wanted all this merchandise stuff. And basically it's a lot of nonsense to take the blame off of them. They did not see him, crazily enough, as world champion material. That just wasn't the Vern Gagne mentality of how to book. Like they looked at somebody like him and they saw, well, first of all, he's not a legitimate wrestler because that was his big thing. Nick Bockwinkel was, Vern was. And also Vern didn't like the idea of this big, giant, unstoppable baby face as your world champion. Like in his mind, if a baby face is the world champ, he needs to be like an underdog champ, who you think is going to lose, or, you have to get behind him. If you have a big hulking world champ, he needs to be a heel. So it was kind of an old-fashioned way to think about it. And that's how they lost Hogan, and they just blew it.
See, the story I've heard that makes the most sense to me is Vern wanted a piece of his Japan money.
Yes.
He wanted a piece of his actually the majority of his merchandising money, and he wanted money from Rocky.
But here's the thing. Now, all those kind of moves are the same things that Vince would do.
Sure.
The exact same thing.
Yeah.
And Hogan, let him do all of that. I mean, he did give, for the year that he was still going to Japan, he was getting some of that money. And Vince always demanded that he get a piece of anything his wrestlers do, which drove them crazy. That's the reason Sergeant Slaughter left.
Yep.
Because Vince wanted some of the G.I. Joe money. Yeah. And he was like, no, this is my thing. Jesse Ventura left because he did a video game that wasn't a WWF video game. It was like some independent, generic kind of wrestling video game, and he was the host of it. And he walked because of that. So I don't know. It doesn't hold water for me because this is all the stuff that Vince would later do, and nobody had a problem when Vince was doing it. So why would they have a problem with Vern Gagne doing it?
Didn't Scott Hall? He said he left WWF because he wanted to go to Japan for more paydays, and Vince wouldn't let him. And that's just go to Japan.
It's a lot of the control stuff. Like I actually think one of the issues of Sasha Banks recently walking out was because they were trying to pull that stuff with her when she was on The Mandalorian. And they were trying to say, well, you wouldn't get these opportunities without the company behind you. And that's not why she left, but it was one of the straws that broke the camel's back. So that was just the way that they did business,
And the crazy thing, and we'll wrap up here with this, is that to me, because we've gone again, we started and ended not on Portland, and I'm okay with it. But it's the crazy thing to me is AWA and WWF in 83, early 84 are not. AWA may have been the closest one to them.
Yeah, they were still doing really well at that.
Yeah, and Crockett was not too far away, but in third. But just from a television penetration standpoint, AWA was in position to make the jump. They had the most nationwide penetration. They were going all the way to New Mexico.
They had the whole Midwest.
Yeah.
They were going into parts of Canada, like they were in Winnipeg.
Yeah.
They were in Northern California. They were in Las Vegas.
Didn't they run? They ran a lot of shows in Vegas.
The Showboat. Yeah. But the Showboat started later, but yeah, they did.
Yeah, because Vegas was kind of Nevada, and that was kind of like an open territory. A lot of people would try and come in there and run it. Arizona, that whole area there.
But they just it's so weird to think about had it switched. Hogan stays in AWA and Vern Gagne is the one that leads to national.
I don't think it would have worked because there's that question that everybody always asks, like, was it Vince or was it Hogan? And the real answer is it's both. I don't think it works with just one, even with just Vince. I don't think Hogan was replaceable. It was like, well, if it wasn't Hogan, who would it have been? It would have been nobody, because whoever they put in that spot, I'm sorry to say, I really do think it would have failed. There was a lot of other options. They were talking about maybe Kerry Von Erich. That would have been a disaster. They were talking about Dusty. And I think that probably had the best chance, but I don't think it would have worked because he didn't have the superhero physique like Hogan had. He didn't have that crossover appeal. There was talk of Jimmy Snuka. It would have been another disaster. Snuka was already there. I think Hacksaw Jim Duggan, because at the time he was really hot for Bill Watts in like 83, 84.
Yeah, he was down in Mid-South.
There was talk of him, but I just don't think it would have worked. It wouldn't have worked without Hogan, and it wouldn't have worked without Vince. So if Hogan stayed in the AWA, it would not have worked with Vern Gagne doing it.
Right. I think I've heard Ted DiBiase's name brought up in that before.
Ted DiBiase was, I think that with it, I don't know if it was for the Hogan push. I think when it was the Backlund situation, if I remember it right. So like in the late 70s, when they were looking to move away from Bruno, I think Ted DiBiase, who was a really hot young baby face at the time, was one of the names that came up, and he actually came into the company in like 79 for a little while. But it wound up being Backlund. I think that's what the DiBiase thing was.
Well, I have had a blast doing this. I love talking about historical wrestling, especially with people like Dave who haven't had the chance to learn about some of this stuff, but want to. And again, you don't hear a lot about Portland wrestling. I actually went and looked. I don't think there's ever been a podcast on Portland wrestling, so we may be the first. And I could not be happier to do this with you. So thank you everyone for listening to this edition from Wrestling from Rose City. Hope you love it. We're going to do episode 2 on Kurt Van Poppenheim, which, first of all, this was the 1960s. How can you not like that look? And for our esteemed panel, Brian Solomon, Dave, I'm TJ Stevens, and we'll see you next time on Wrestling from Rose City.